Welcome to the Kick Sugar Coach podcast. Join me each week as I interview experts who will share the science of sugar, sugar addiction, and different approaches to recovery. We hope to empower you with the information and inspiration, insights, and strategies you need to break up with sugar and fall in love with healthy whole foods so you can prevent and reverse chronic disease, lose weight, boost your mood and energy. Feel free to go to my website for details on my coaching programs and to access free resources, kicksugarcoach.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am very pleased and very excited to interview and introduce Dr. Anna Lembke. She is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She's a clinician scholar, has published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, and commentaries. She sits on a variety of different boards. She, in 2016, published a book called Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. I believe that's in relation to the opiate crisis. This book was highlighted in the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to understand the opioid epidemic. Dr. Lembke also recently appeared in the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, talking about the impact of social media on our lives. And most recently, she has published the book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, which became an instant New York Times bestseller. And it explores how modern compulsive overconsumption is happening in our dopamine overloaded world. Welcome, Dr. Lembke.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I have to just start by saying, if you have not yet got your copy of Dopamine Nation, you can read it in hard copy. You can also listen to it on Audible, which is what I did. And it starts out with this gripping story of one of Dr. Lembke's patients who very, very young, I believe it was at the age of 4, got hooked on masturbation, but really the most elaborate, shocking story. Like if it was in a movie, I would think in my head, who thinks these things up? Like you think it was like you made these stories up in your book, but obviously, you didn't. So
yeah, and so first let me just express gratitude to my wonderful patients who are willing to share their stories, using pseudonyms, because it was very brave of them to do that and very generous. But also importantly, all of the stories are true. None of it is made up. Some slight, maybe demographic or geographical things are changed to hide identity. And I do think that that's a strength of the book, that it's not a composite patient, not that there's not value in that, but that these are real life people, and really, art does imitate life, because these are situations that it's hard to imagine we can get ourselves into, and yet we do. These are the lives that we live now, and any of us, could end up there.
And really, in some ways, when I was listening to them, some of those stories, I was just gobsmacked by some of them. Some of the intensity and the creativeness of getting these dopamine fixes blew my mind. And then I think, Florence, you think back to some of the stuff you've done with food, girlfriend, and it is no less crazy. I have dug food out of the garbage. When I was a kid, I used to go down and pick gobs of gum from underneath seats, like stuff that disgusts me today, right? Like, no, we're probably all falling somewhere on this spectrum these days. And it's good to be forced or be invited to be reflective of in what ways are we hooked on dopamine, and what ways is it narrowing our lives and creating despair and pain. And so talk to us about what's so wrong with being hooked on dopamine, and how did so many of us get hooked on dopamine?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for sharing those, honest details about your own struggles. I always find that very moving, and I'm grateful for that. So dopamine, it's not bad or good. It is a chemical that our brains make that are essential, that to our survival, because dopamine is the molecule that tells us whether or not this is something that we should approach or try to get more of. And for most of human existence, we have lived in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which means that our ability to strive to get the things that we need to survive are absolutely fundamental, and dopamine allows us to do that. Essentially, when we have an experience that our body tells us is necessary for survival, food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate, that releases dopamine in a very specific part of the reward path of the brain called the reward pathway. And that tells us, first of all, it feels good, right? So we have dopamine is constantly firing at a tonic baseline level. When we do something that we need, that our brains interpret we need for survival, dopamine firing increases above baseline levels. The higher it goes and the faster it goes, the more reinforcing it is. So the fundamental sort of signature of things that are addictive are things that release a lot of dopamine and release a lot of dopamine very quickly. And again, we're wired for that, right? We want to recreate that experience. It is what has allowed us to survive in a world of scarcity. The problem being that now we no longer live in that world. We now live in a world of almost universal access to instant gratification. Science has allowed the engineering of highly potent, highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors really at the touch of a fingertip. And as a result, our brains are now having to process a fire hose of dopamine, right? And that is what has led to the kinds of problems that we're seeing today. So it's not that dopamine is bad, it's that dopamine is the molecule that gets us to approach and seek out and want more of. And that's really adaptive in a world that is very unlike the world that we inhabit now.
Yeah, it has always struck me as completely insane that my body would crave and call for processed foods that I knew would consistently would trigger migraines, depression, infections, later cancer, like 45 pounds extra on my body. Like, it was like so confusing to me. Why are you calling for this while it's slowly killing you? Like, what kind of malfunction is going on in my body? And of course, I thought I was the malfunction. I thought, what is wrong with me that I know if I eat this pizza, tomorrow I'm going to be sick. Like, what is going on here? Can you help us understand why the body would drive us towards substances that are killing us at the same time?
Yeah. So I love that, you have shifted the frame, which is a fundamental shift, that it's not that there's something wrong with our brains per se. It's that we have created a drug that is so reinforcing that it releases far more dopamine than our brains evolved to accommodate. So then there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that it's a mismatch between our primitive wiring and the modern ecosystem. So I think that's really important, because what you identified in your younger years as something wrong with you because you wanted to eat more pizza, also then goes along with shame and blame. Whereas if you had been able to see that, pizza is food that has been engineered to be addictive. And that means that it is very easy for my brain to mistake pizza as essential for my survival, when in fact, what pizza is really doing is confusing my reward pathways by releasing so much dopamine all at once that then again leads to this spiraling decompensation mechanism where we then go into this dopamine deficit state, which I talk about in Dopamine Nation using this extended metaphor of a balance. But the bottom line is then we get into that vicious cycle where when that drug is no longer giving us pleasure, because with repeated exposure, what happens is it stops releasing dopamine and instead leads to this dopamine deficit state. But the drive and the motivation and the equating that drug with survival, that persists. And that's the ways in which our brain becomes confused when faced with a drug that's been engineered to be addictive.
Right. Right. And with respect to refined carbohydrates and ultra processed foods, which is kind of the focus of our summit, because there's so many of us that have been listening to the news and watching the science roll out. Like, we all know better now that really we should be significantly reducing, if not eliminating, these refined carbohydrates. And as we start on that path, we realize, dang, this is harder than I thought. Like, this shouldn't be this hard. And I suppose innocently at first, our clever little brains, we learned how to turn grains into powders, and that turned into sugar really quickly in our bodies and spiked our feel-good neurotransmitters. And then over time, I think what was probably an innocent refinement process that brought some pleasure became like almost a sinister genius lab, engineering, like to hit our bliss point and to have us become hooked. And the food giants, they know what they're doing now. Like, they know what hits the spot and gets us eating these foods, despite the fact that we're obese and depressed and have cancer. Like, I've had clients that have come to me that have had diabetes for 20 years and cancer twice. Yeah. And then they'll say, okay, now I'm ready. Like, I'm ready. Like, now I want to, I really know I've needed to get off this, but now I'm scared. And so what do we do when these foods that have been processed, that are creating such a dopamine hook, how do we begin the process of unhooking?
Right. I think the first thing is to recognize what is happening in our brain, and the fact that pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain and work like opposite sides of a balance. And one of the overarching rules governing that balance, with pleasure on one side and pain on the other, is that it wants to remain level, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, and that our bodies and brains will work very hard to reassert a level balance or homeostasis after any deviation from neutrality. And the way the brain does that, and this is really the key, is first by tipping an equal and opposite amount to whatever the initial stimulus was. So when we eat refined foods, we get a release of dopamine in the reward pathway. Our pleasure-pain balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brain will want to restore a level balance, but it doesn't do it just by going level. It does it first by tipping an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's the come down, the after effect, the hangover. And that's what we get from eating sugar and refined foods. We go into a dopamine free fall, right? Where we have a come down. And of course, the natural response when our pleasure pain balance is tilted to the side of pain after that initial pleasure is to reach for more of said drug to get us out of that painful state. So that's, I think, really the key, is that when you have these potent pleasures that cause this huge deviation from neutrality, which is, by the way, also a stressor and triggers cortisol and the stress response in the process of trying to restore homeostasis, what you get is its opposite in pain. And an environment where you then have immediate, easy access to more of that drug, then you will take more of it, right? To try to, but here's the tricky part: with repeated exposure to the same or similar initial stimulus, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but the after effect to pain gets stronger and longer. And ultimately, over time, we get a pleasure-pain balance that's chronically tilted to the side of pain. We're in a dopamine deficit state. And now we need our drug not to feel good, but just to level the balance and feel normal. So that's the vicious cycle that we're dealing with. And that informs what we need to do about it. And what we need to do about it is, first and foremost, abstain from our drug of choice long enough to give the body time to reset normal dopamine firing and for that balance to restore homeostasis in the absence of drug. The other thing we need to do is put barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice, self-binding strategies, so that if we experience a dopamine, a little dopamine hit, and its opposite, the come down, we know we can more easily press the pause button between wanting to restore homeostasis by grabbing more of our drug and actually grabbing it, because it's not immediately available to us. So these are common sense strategies, like not having the potato chips in the house, right? The other thing to recognize is that dopamine spike is triggered, not just by the drug itself, but also by reminders of the drug. And reminders of the drug can be people, places, and things, as they say in AA, but it can also be our own euphoric recall. So when we think about, and this is where these insidious food videos are so horrible, when we're watching a food video, or we're just remembering, a euphoric experience with eating, usually one of the earlier experiences, because of course, as time goes on and with repeated exposure, there's no longer pleasure, but we're still craving it because we're in that dopamine deficit state. Even euphoric recall can release a little bit of dopamine, which is followed by a dopamine deficit state, which then creates the craving to go out and get the drug to restore homeostasis. So I think the key piece here is that although we often think of addiction as about pleasure seeking, it's really not about that. It's really about getting out of pain and restoring homeostasis after we've gone into this dopamine deficit state, which is very similar to a kind of clinical depression, because the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. So again, simple first-line interventions: abstain from the drug for long enough to reset dopamine homeostasis. On average, this takes about 30 days. And then implementing self-binding strategies. These are literal and metacognitive barriers that we put between ourselves and our drug of choice, so that if we do, through, let's say, euphoric recall or triggers, have a craving to use, we would have to do a lot more work to get it, right? Because it's not easily accessible.
Amazing. So with respect to the whole abstaining, almost every addict in the early stages of hearing those words are like terrified, and they feel grief and no, there's got to be another way, and of course we try all kinds of things. Some of us are so desperate to avoid abstaining from our drug of choice, in our case, sugar, refined carbohydrates, that we would rather do supplements or surgeries or pharmaceuticals or therapy or something, right? We'll do almost anything to try and be able to do anything except for truly abstain. So with respect to abstinence, though, it's like really interesting that the research is showing that we do need to abstain to repair the brain, to bring it back to baseline. But the question then becomes, because every addict knows, okay, great, even if I put down this drug that I've got, there's other ones that crop up. So to what extent do we need to really be tuned into what exactly are the things in our lives that are tweaking our dopamine levels above baseline, that's still keeping that addict brain alive, that's just spinning us around just in different directions in different ways?
Yeah, so first of all, let me backtrack a little bit and say that the surgeries and things that people get, some people, are needing to do that in order to abstain. So it's not necessarily always like you either abstain or you get the surgery. Sometimes people need the surgeries or other kinds of medical interventions, let's say medication, to help them abstain. And I think that's okay. We have to make room in that for the more severe cases where people they need that additional help. In terms of cross addiction, so all drugs, all addictive substances and behaviors, because behaviors can also be addictive: gambling, pornography, social media, gaming, shopping, you name it. All of those drugs and behaviors work on the same final reward pathway. They all release dopamine ultimately. So they work by different mechanisms: the endogenous cannabinoid system, the endogenous opioid system, serotonin, norepinephrine. But the final common pathway for all of these substances and behaviors is dopamine, which means that as we're working on one drug of choice, we are vulnerable to what's called cross addiction, where we just switch to another substance or a behavior to replace the first behavior. And unfortunately, that doesn't really work, because what ends up happening is that initially it may help us restore homeostasis, but ultimately, as I talk about these neuroadaptation gremlins, more of them will hop on the pain side of the balance and will be in the same position. This has been shown with animal studies. For example, if you take a rat and you get it addicted to cocaine, and then you remove cocaine for a year, which is about a rat lifetime, and then you expose that rat to cannabis, it's much easier to get that rat addicted to cannabis if it had previously been addicted to cocaine than if it had never been addicted to anything. So that's one of the many clues we have, that once people become addicted, it does leave a kind of latent scar in the brain that makes them vulnerable to future addictions. So that means we just have to be very mindful of cross addiction. This kind of standard idea that you can just replace one drug with another or one reward with another as a way to get out of addictive use really doesn't work in the long term. And instead, what you need to learn to do is to sit with and tolerate discomfort, which is something that we really don't learn, in our culture. We don't have many opportunities to practice that because there are so many distractors and ways to comfort ourselves. It's very countercultural. So we also feel like we're the only ones and everybody else is out there having fun. And it's hard to, suffer alone. Whereas if you're suffering, with others for a common purpose and meaning, it's much easier to tolerate pain. In fact, we can tolerate a lot of pain if we feel like we're not the only one and it's for some higher meaning or purpose. And this is where kind of mutual help groups can be really helpful too, where you have a group of peers going through the same thing at the same time, suffering together. But counterintuitively, the other thing that we can do is intentionally do things that are more painful than the pain of withdrawal. And the reason for that is if the initial stimulus is pain, then actually those neuroadaptation gremlins hop on the pleasure side. And that means that the opposite effect of the initial stimulus of pain is actually pleasure. And this is the runner's high after exercise. This is the kind of mood boost that people get from ice cold water baths, or really any kind of hard thing, that we do incrementally in small doses over longer periods of time. So when people are saying to me, well, how can I get through the pain of withdrawal? The intuitive thing is, well, make yourself comfortable, watch a Netflix show, use another reward instead of the what you're trying to give up. But that only goes so far. What I will say to patients is, well, in that moment, if you can do 25 sit-ups, right? Or plunge your face in an ice cold water. The idea being that pleasure and pain, because they're co-located, are tied to each other and they're relative. So one of the ways to escape pain is to do something that's more painful. And then that first pain, relatively speaking, doesn't look so bad.
That's actually clearer than when you said it in the book. Like, that is really an interesting strategy. And how long do people need to do that to actually sort of make themselves feel more pain before the brain heals and they can feel good without leaning on, substances of abuse or behaviors of abuse?
Yeah. So my hypothesis is that because we live in a world that's saturated with dopamine and we have at our fingertips so much access to these highly reinforcing intoxicants, and because we're relatively so insulated from pain, that it is become that we as humans actually now need to intentionally invite pain into our lives on a regular basis. So how long does it take? How much do you have to do that painful thing? I would argue we have to do that as a daily practice for life, right? That we really have to reframe pain. Now, I'm not talking about cutting on yourself. In fact, cutting on yourself releases endogenous endorphins, because the way that pain is healing is that it tells your body, oh my gosh, we're in a dangerous situation. We need to upregulate production of feel-good neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine. But we need to make sure that we don't do pain in too high doses, because what we get with cutting, for example, is we get a surge in endogenous opioids, which leads to the release of dopamine. But very quickly, our brain then adapts to that, so that effectively cutting amounts to an intoxicant, right? So we're not talking about that type of thing, because that type of thing can in and of itself be addictive. Even exercise can be addictive, or other, so we're talking about sub-threshold levels of pain, mild to moderate, at whatever you can tolerate, in regular increments on a regular basis, in order to change our pleasure pain set point.
Right. And I love that it could be something as simple as, I really don't want to get off the couch and stop watching Netflix and eating popcorn. I'm going to get up, I'm going to put my shoes on, and I'm going to go for a walk around the block, right? Because it's painful. I don't want to be doing this. My body wants to just be comforted.
Right.
And so that would be an example.
That's a great example, because that's pretty much where we are as a society. We're not talking about, for most of us, climbing Everest. We're talking about finding the will inside of ourselves to not press next episode, and instead to get up off the couch, put on our shoes, go outside and go for a walk, and anticipate that the walk will be possibly unpleasant the entire time, that it won't be fun and won't feel good, but that we're, resetting our reward pathways.
Amazing. And I call that the daily grind, because once we put down sugar and refined carbohydrates, it's one thing to stop a behavior, but then we have to start the behavior of making 3 whole meals.
Yeah.
And it's a grind. It's a lot of work to wash and chop and cook and, like really take care of our bodies really well. And there's like 8 different ones that we kind of recommend, and they are hard work and they are uncomfortable.
Yes.
Over time, it's really interesting that almost all of us recognize that slowly our body starts to crave it.
Right.
We crave the walk in the rain. We crave the run. We crave getting into the kitchen to make a beautiful meal and to sit down and eat it mindfully. That we begin to crave the things that truly nurture and nourish and strengthen our bodies.
Yeah, that's so great. And so the other thing that's happening in the brain with that is that we're creating new neural networks. So, what wires together the neural networks that we practice daily, whether they're in the addiction direction or in a healthy and adaptive direction. That's what then ends up, getting a lot of oxygen. So it is the repetitive behaviors over time in a healthy direction that ultimately deprive those maladaptive circuits of oxygen, strengthen those new circuits, and then those become the default circuits, or the default resting networks as we think about it. And, that is essentially what habit formation is. Habit formation is our neural circuits that we use reflexively without the cognitive load of having to decide to do it one way or another. And once you get into healthy behaviors and healthy habits, that's just sort of your default circuit. It'll be harder to decide to not make the healthy meal and go to McDonald's than to just do the thing that you've been doing for the past 100 days, which is buy the groceries and make the meal and sit down and eat it. And so we really are quite simple, beings in a funny kind of way. We make things complicated, but, with repetition of behavior, the behaviors become habitual. And this is really important because I often tell my patients, you can't wait till you feel like doing a new behavior, because that day will never come. You have to do the new behavior repetitively until it becomes an ingrained neural network. And then you will discover that you enjoy the behavior, or that the behavior is rewarding, or that you don't even recognize the person who did the other behaviors. But you have to kind of act contrary to feelings. And this is, of course, very countercultural too, right? Because we are all about, what am I feeling in the moment? Why am I feeling this? If I only understood why I feel what I feel, then that would change my behavior. But it's really not true. Behaviors get a life of their own. And we have to change behaviors. It's a great saying in AA, fake it till you make it, which is really important in early recovery. So those first couple of months of, not using.
It's just so cool, because I think that we can endure pain and hard things and tough times if we know they're going to end, and if we know we're heading in a better direction. And I feel like if every sugar addict, food addict can think about the hard work of being tired and miserable and having cravings, and our moods are really low and we're irritable, and we just think this is going to go on forever, and we'll crave sugar and feel deprived and left out for the rest of our lives, and know that that's just a temporary phase of recovery, and that every day as we do the painful grind, that painful grind of doing things differently is actually rebalancing our brain. It's like the healing work, because it doesn't feel that way when you're in the middle of it.
That's right. It's so interesting. One of my patients described recovery as akin to a scene in Harry Potter when Dumbledore progresses down a dark alley and on his way lights the lampposts as he goes. And then when he gets to the end of the alley, turns around and sees that the alley's, illuminated. And I think that's a wonderful metaphor for recovery, because it takes a lot of courage to enter and go down a dark alley and not know where you're going to end up, and to be frightened and to be groping in the dark. But if you just light each lamppost as you go, you will get to the end and you'll look behind you and it'll be this wonderful illuminated scene. So
Oh, I love that. And you know which one has come to mind for me? There's a scene in, with Simba, the Lion King.
yeah.
And he's born into this beautiful, lush landscape with this wonderful family that loves him and they're friends and everyone's wonderful and all kinds of color. And then slowly, as he moves toward where the hyenas are, and it's dark and it's gray and it's cold and it's sinister, it's like the dark alley that's scary, where that to me is the land of addiction, right? And so it's colorless, and all we're doing is we're just living for these little scraps of something that might try and take the edge off the pain and despair and anxiety in us. But slowly, as we walk out of the dark gray hyena land, the addiction world, we get more color and it gets warmer and the sun comes out and then the birds are chirping and there's beautiful, happy people there that are walking the road of recovery and they're welcoming you and saying, you came, you arrived. But we don't believe while we're walking that we're ever going to get there. It's just so, what words can you offer people that the brain will heal, that we will end in this lush, loving, new, happy place?
Well, I like to talk a little bit about the neuroscience here and the ways in which addiction is the process of disconnecting the prefrontal cortex from the midbrain limbic structures. So the midbrain limbic structures, that's the reward pathway, this pleasure-pain balance. And when things are working correctly, that's kind of like the accelerator of the car. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the gray matter area right behind our foreheads, is the brakes of the car. The prefrontal cortex is where we anticipate future consequences. It's the storytelling area. It's the delayed gratification area. And it's really important for us to, mindfully manage our consumption by putting the brakes on, at certain intervals. And what you'll see very clearly in the brain is there are these strong neural connections between the deeper reward pathway, the limbic emotion structures, and this prefrontal cortex. That's like, it's a highway, right? They're talking to each other, and dopamine is very involved in that. And what seems to happen in the process of becoming addicted is that we actually disconnect the prefrontal cortex from the limbic area. So they're no longer talking to each other. And that means that limbic area gets a life of its own, and we're being driven by that raw animal, what's often referred to as the triune brain or the lizard brain. Why is it called that? Because it's been, our reward pathway is essentially unchanged over millions of years of evolution and identical to a lizard and any other species you could name. That's how conserved it is in nature. And once we're in lizard brain, we really cannot see true cause and effect. We truly lack the capacity to see the impact of our drug use on our lives. We cannot see it. Just like a person with bipolar disorder in mania can't see that they're not really God, or a person with schizophrenia and delusions can't really see that there's not a chip implanted in their brain, right? It really is a kind of a delusional state where we can't see the connection. And that's why that homeostasis is so important, and that period of abstinence is so important. It's hard, but once we reset reward pathways, the other thing we reset is the connections between our lizard brain and the prefrontal cortical area behind our foreheads, so that they're talking to each other again. Once that happens, then we're able to say, oh, wow. And I see this all the time in my patients after they abstain for a month. They will come back and say, I really wasn't able to see the impact of my drug use on my life, but now I can see it. And in fact, when I look back at my drug using self, it's surreal to me. And I love the use of that word surreal, because there really has that quality, like, who is that person that was willing to do those crazy things and sacrifice so much for that drug? It seems bizarre. I can't feel it now, what that person was feeling. It's so bizarre. And yet when we're in it, it's the only thing that makes sense, is to get more of our drug. So that's very, fascinating to me, how abstinence can allow for that circuitry to reconnect, allow us to have the insight, which we absolutely need to get, to be able to make informed decisions going forward.
How does abstinence do that? Why does the neocortex come back online after a 30-day break, like a clean, total break?
Well, I think it's a matter of valence, right? So again, you have this notion, this is Hebb's notion, what fires together wires together. This is a fundamental neuroscientific concept, that the circuits that we use most often are the ones that get strengthened, right? And make new circuits. There's what's called synaptic plasticity. The synapse is the area between neurons, and they become elaborated, and they're changing all the time, making new connections. So what essentially happens in addiction is that we stop using our prefrontal cortex, right? We stop telling true stories, right? We tell stories that are not true, that are, addiction stories that allow us to continue to lead this double life, lie to ourselves, lie to others. So we're essentially not telling, those stories go offline. We're not engaging that part of the brain that allows us to truthfully anticipate the future consequences of our behavior, which is what the prefrontal cortex does. So, for example, imaging studies have shown that when people are engaging in immediate rewards, like rewards that they get right away, the part of the brain that lights up is the emotion brain, the lizard brain, not the prefrontal cortex. When people are engaging in a task related to remote rewards, that is to say, rewards far in the future, the part of the brain that lights up is the prefrontal cortex. So what happens in addiction, just like any muscle, we stop exercising the prefrontal cortex and it atrophies, bless you, and we're exercising our pleasure pain balance, our sort of emotion brain, our immediate reward brain, and then that just takes over. And then we're basically behaving at a very primitive animalistic level.
Right. And very self-harming, which is, it's just baffling that somehow it's like this loophole. And it just seems to me that addiction is sort of like a malfunction at the brain level. So with respect to food addiction, is it possible that it might take us longer than 30 days to reset? Because I think generally speaking, most of us coaching and working in the space in 12-step programs would say we need a full 90 days, it seems, for that neocortex to really sort of be strong enough to start to apply the brakes with some confidence. What would you say to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so when I say 30 days is like the bare minimum in my clinical experience, that people need to begin to have some insight, right? And to begin to be able to see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that they actually start to feel better. So the key piece here is that in those first 2 weeks, people go into withdrawal. Again, universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior, including food, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. But in my experience, once people get to about week 3 and 4, they start to feel better. Does that mean that they've completely restored homeostasis and they're good to go? Absolutely not. Especially for a drug that involves food, which we need to survive, right? We can't just not eat. So we're talking about having to create different eating habits, not stop eating altogether. So that's more challenging in many ways, right? So, and the data will show, and this is also true for alcohol. Like alcohol, you're just kind of barely coming out of your stupor at 30 days. Really 90 days, those people tend to do better. So, and that's been shown, with traditional drugs as well, that, people who abstain longer have a greater chance of success going forward. And I would say that healing process goes even further than that. Like it probably most of the time, once we've been addicted, we're talking 18 to 24 months really to get to that place where people are in a robust recovery and can have confidence and kind of count on their recovery as they continue to do their work, because we know in a dopamine overloaded world, we're all at risk for relapse because we're constantly being chased down by these drugs. We can't avoid them when we want to.
Yes. I love that. Yeah, because I've heard that too, 18 to year and a half to 2 years to really feel like you've got a very solid, resilient recovery. Oh gosh, I just had a really good question. Just went out of my head. Just give me 1 second. Oh, I know. So you're going to hear this. I'm sure you hear this from your clients. I hear it all the time. I've thought this a million times my own self, but can't I just have a bite? Can't I just make one? It's my birthday. Can't I just make an exception? What would you say to that?
So what I like to do is cite this really important animal study that basically took a bunch of rats and exposed them to injections of cocaine consecutively over 7 days. And typically a rat in a cage will hide and hover along the edges. Rats don't like to go out into the exposed middle area. But with each successive day of cocaine, rats will move into that middle area and they'll start jogging and then they'll start running. And by day 7, they're in a running frenzy, just going all over, right? Because cocaine is a stimulant. Then if you don't give that rat any cocaine for a year, which again is about a rat lifetime, and then you take that same rat and you give it a single injection of cocaine, what you observe is that the rat is immediately in a running frenzy, similar to what they were at day 7. In other words, once the rat has been exposed to a week of cocaine, it does appear that there's some type of fundamental permanent brain change, such that even after a rat lifetime, a single exposure of that same drug can plunge the animal right back to where they were at the height of the running frenzy. And we see this all the time in clinical work. A patient who's been in recovery from addiction, let's say from alcohol for decades, has a single exposure to alcohol, or maybe to a drug like an opioid, which works on the endogenous opioid system, and alcohol works on the endogenous opioid system. So they're similar. And then immediately that person is plunged back into their severe addiction without any kind of startup time. Again, suggesting that that brain is fundamentally altered. The neuroscience shows that too, that recovery is probably a process of creating new neural networks that reroute around those damaged areas, and that those damaged areas probably never heal, right? That there's healing occurs, but it occurs because of rerouting and new neural networks being created. Those networks never go away. And so that's really important, because when we think about, just one bite, what we're really doing is tempting fate there, and we're tempting biology, more importantly, because we're really inviting the possibility of, reawakening those latent neural pathways and potentially plunging ourselves, right back into it. That's not going to happen to everybody. What is a more common scenario is an initial ability to sort of moderate, and then a slow slippage back to addictive use for many people with severe addiction. In my experience, it's a real minority of people who can moderate their use once they've been addicted to a drug. I do see that, but it takes a lot of effort, so much so that many patients will say it's not worth it. Like, it's more exhausting to me to try to moderate my use than to just abstain. But it can take a long time for people to realize that.
Oh my gosh, this is the most precious interview. I love it. Great. So we just have a little bit of time left, and I want to indulge a question about a really interesting part of your book. In the book, you're talking about some science around gambling and how gamblers, the height of their dopamine, it peaks in that moment of uncertainty before, is that going to land am I going to win or am I going to lose?
Yeah.
And I stopped the recording because I listened to the book on Audible. And I was like, what did she just say? And I went back and I listened to it again. And I went back and it was like 2 or 3 times. And I was like, that is gobsmacking. What implications might that have for my own addiction and for other addictions? Like, what is there and then at the end, you had shared a story about a woman who said, you're right. Like, I almost want to lose. Remember, that was the part. She said, it's like my body wants to lose. And I thought, why? Why would an addict want to lose?
Yeah.
And so I thought, do I want to feel bad as a sugar addict? Like, do I actually get some kind of sick brain reward for being miserable, for being in states of deprivation, being in cortisol and fatigue and whatever else, it was doing to me? What would you have to say about that?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I think it works on a bunch of different levels. First, the neuroscience. So this is a really interesting series of experiments looking at dopamine release in the brains of addicted gamblers and healthy controls, and finding that with winning, during a gambling task, both gamblers and healthy controls had an increase in dopamine. But the fascinating part was that when healthy controls lost, they had no dopamine spike. But when addicted gamblers lost, they actually had a dopamine spike. So somehow or another, losing was also rewarding for them. And in fact, the greatest dopamine spike for addicted gamblers is at the point of maximal uncertainty, when the chances of winning and the chances of losing are equal. So that is really fascinating, because what it tells us is that it's, for an addicted gambler, it's not really about accumulating the tangible reward or the intangible reward. If it's like, some kind of virtual currency, which a lot of people describe now, getting addicted to something where they're not even really actually winning money, but they're winning a virtual currency that they can't even use to buy. And what happens with people who get addicted to gambling, who are vulnerable to this problem, is that it's not really anymore about winning. It's about being in that state or that flow state of gambling. So what they're addicted to is the process of the game, which allows them to, it's a transformed and really transcendent mental space where they're not having to be in the world. And that's what they're looking for, the escape, right? And it's not about getting money, right? It's about being in that point of maximal uncertainty, anticipating the maximal dopamine, and then wanting to do it again, even if that means losing. Because a lot of times addicted gamblers will talk about actually wanting to lose, because they know if they lose, then they'll get to play longer. Because once they lose, then they have to keep playing to earn it back. So I think that's a piece of it. I think another piece of it is the ways in which we can actually get addicted to being unhappy. So even outside of the drug chasing moment, we can get attached to our anxiety, our loneliness, our resentments, right? Because they're familiar, right? That's the world we inhabit. And we've now created a very tiny box in which we've squeezed ourselves. And it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. But on some level, it's better than the unknown, right? Or the uncertainty of having to do something new or go out into the world or risk being happy.
Amazing. That vulnerability, the feelings of all, in the real world that we need to reckon with. With respect to food addiction, I'm wondering if there might actually be, probably the science hasn't been done, if there isn't a parallel between the gambler who has noticed that they get a reward from losing. And I wonder if, and it becomes a process of the chase and the losing and the chase and the winning and the losing and the chase. How is that different than dieting, really? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's, my colleague, Rob Malenko, he loves to say that the way that he measures addiction in animals is how hard they're willing to work to get their reward. And when it comes to dieting, it's more complicated, but you're right. It's all that investment in creativity and thought and mental preoccupation. Really, what is addiction? It's largely the mental preoccupation with getting the drug, using the drug, hiding the drug use, starting over again. And that's what we have in addiction. We have this vast neural network that becomes entirely focused on the drug, such that in a way, we don't have to think about other things, right? Because all of our mental real estate is being occupied by this one narrowed goal. And it's that narrowing of the vision that is so awful about addiction, but also, again, kind of safe, right? And kind of like, at least I'm in control of this. So the extent to which addiction is really about control, it's really the illusion of control, but it's the illusion that we have that we are controlling at least this space, that it is part and parcel of the addiction itself.
Oh my gosh, so fascinating. Right. It's like it creates its own crisis. And then we're so focused on this crisis that we can't even think about anything else. It's like it's the whole point of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. Is there any final words you'd like to share today on the topic of sugar, addiction recovery?
Well, I just think it's great that we are now looking at these food problems through the lens of addiction. I've thought for a long time that the lens of addiction was a useful lens in which to conceptualize eating disorders. And so I'm really glad to see that there's a strong groundswell in that direction, because I think that's right.
Yes, it really is. I know, and it's so tempting to deny that it's an addiction. Mm-hmm. We want to call it a bad habit. We want to call it, there's, my trauma from my childhood. It's a character flaw, right? That the whole brain science coming into those of us. One last question, because it's my understanding with the animal studies around addiction, is that if you introduce, let's say, 100 rats, just easy math, or 10 rats, easy math, that about 15% of them they're all introduced to cocaine water, let's say, or cocaine. And then, the cocaine's taken away and water's brought back in. And then the cocaine's brought back in, that only roughly 15% of those rats or mice will remain addicted and die of their addiction, that 85% of them will not go back. Is that the science roughly?
So it is true that it's not that all animals universally, including rats, will get addicted to a given drug, and that these animal models, although they're pretty good models, they're not perfect models, and that it can be really effortful on the part of the scientists to get some strains of animals addicted to certain substances. So, for example, the alcohol models with rats, they're challenging. Like, there's strains of rats who will get addicted to alcohol, and other strains, like you can just be giving them intravenous alcohol and they still really won't choose alcohol. It's not a perfect model, but I think as animal models go, when we're looking at psychiatric disorders, really the models for addiction are far superior to models, for example, like for depression or ADHD or anxiety, because we're actually, the animals are in fact ingesting the substance, and we definitely can get these animals and they will get addicted to the point where they will press the lever for a substance until exhaustion or until they die. So there are robust animal models, but you're right, it's not universal. It does depend on the substance. In general, it's easier to get animals, addicted to opioids and stimulants than alcohol in particular. And food, for example, food addiction, animals will get that too. So I think in general, it's still a really useful model, but it's absolutely not a perfect model. And also, we're not rats, right? So you take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, it just is. It's like a little window of insight for those of us who are on the addiction spectrum to say, I might be one of those strains that this substance and my biochemistry just work. It just lights my brain up, and it's not.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. This inter-individual variability and this concept of drug of choice. That what is addictive for one person is not going to be addictive for another person. For some people, they can't imagine being addicted to food. Others can't imagine being addicted to a stimulant. And that's our individual wiring, and that's probably evolutionary too. Like in a tribe, you wouldn't want everybody to be seeking out the same reward. To the benefit of the broader group, you would want people putting in effort to get different things. So as a group, we have everything we need.
Oh, that's a fascinating angle on all that. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful interview. Thank you for your book. And everybody, you go out and buy it. See you soon.
Thanks so much. Great conversation. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in this week. If you would like more interviews, more information, and more inspiration on how to break up with sugar, go to my YouTube channel, Kick Sugar Coach, or my website, kicksugarcoach.com. See you next week.